This marriage is over. My mother's shrill voice cut through the crisp afternoon air, louder than the string quartet still playing faintly in the background. Then, before I could turn fully to face her, she shoved me right in the middle of the marble garden stage, in front of 200 guests, in front of the man I was just about to marry. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell us what would you do in this situation? Be honest, tell me in the comments below. We read every comment. Let's begin. I fell hard, landing with a sharp thud on the stone steps. The crowd gasped in unison as my bouquet went flying, scattering white peonies across the aisle. "You're marrying a failure," she shouted again, face twisted with rage. And then came my father, slowly walking up, calmly brushing invisible lint off his tuxedo. He didn't help me up. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he looked at the crowd and said with a smile, "She's always been a disappointment." Laughter rippled through the left side of the garden, the relatives section. My Uncle Kyle smirked. My cousin Jenna rolled her eyes like this was a Netflix special. I lay there stunned, palms stinging from the fall. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of champagne glasses clinking continued like nothing had happened. Then I saw a hand reach down. His hand. Ryan. My groom. My love. He didn't speak at first. He just helped me up, carefully straightening my dress, dusting off the tulle. Then he stepped in front of me. He took the mic from the event coordinator with terrifying calm. "I was going to stay silent," he said. "But clearly you all want a show." The laughter died instantly. He looked at my mother. "You called me a failure?" She crossed her arms. "You work in a garage." He nodded once. "That's what you think." Then he reached into his blazer pocket and pulled out a small, black folder. He opened it slowly and held up the cover. And just like that, everything stopped. Gasps. Murmurs. One lady in the back dropped her champagne flute. On the cover, Sinclair Enterprises, Trustee Transfer Files. Name, Ryan Alexander Sinclair. My mother's jaw clenched. My father took a step back, and my cousin Jenna suddenly sat down like she might faint. Ryan looked at them and said evenly, "I am not the failure in this story. I'm the only son of Alexander Sinclair, and your daughter just became the future CEO of a $42 billion empire." The garden went dead silent. All you could hear was the wind brushing through the trees. And me? I stood tall, still shaken, dress slightly torn, cheeks burning, but finally holding the mic. I looked right at my parents and whispered into it for everyone to hear. "Should have let the wedding finish." The silence didn't last long. In luxury weddings, silence is dangerous. It lets truth echo. And that's exactly what happened. Gasps turned into whispers. Whispers turned into stares. People craned their necks to get a better look at the man who had just flipped the entire power dynamic of the day. The man they thought was a nobody was actually someone they feared. Ryan Sinclair, heir to the Sinclair estate. A man who could buy the entire venue without blinking, and maybe already had. My mother's face twisted, but this time not in power. In panic. She stepped forward, tried to chuckle through it. "Ryan, sweetheart, you could have just told us. Of course we would have welcomed you. We had no idea." Ryan stared at her, like someone inspecting a smudge on a mirror. "You screamed at your daughter," he said. "You pushed her off a stage." His voice dropped lower. "You humiliated her for who you thought I was." My father, voice strained, tried to salvage what little dignity he had left. "Look, Ryan, we may have overreacted, but you can't expect us to just hand her off to someone who, well, looked like a commoner. You drove a beat-up pickup. You wore thrift clothes. Ryan's lip curled. "That truck was my grandfather's. I wear what I want. I wanted your daughter, not your approval." Boom. That one sentence hit harder than the fall I had taken minutes ago. I saw Aunt Marlene whisper something to Uncle Greg. He turned pale. I caught a few muttered words. "Sinclair contracts, we just signed a deal." And then it dawned on me. This wasn't just about family. This was business. Real power. Real consequences. Ryan turned back to the crowd and said flatly, I know many of you here have smiled to my face while gossiping behind our backs. I know which one of you called her a desperate gold digger on Facebook. I know who said I was probably a mechanic with a ring on layaway. He scanned the rows of guests. No one dared look up. Just know, he continued, those screenshots are saved. And legal has them now. Several people sat down instantly. One woman near the dessert table dropped her macaroon. And then Ryan turned to me, eyes soft, fierce, unshakable. You're not marrying into wealth. You're claiming your crown. You've already earned it by being the only person in this entire garden who knows how to love without condition. I could barely swallow the lump in my throat. And still, my mother wouldn't give up. You think this will scare us? You think money means you can rewrite what she is? Ryan's expression turned to stone. I'm not trying to rewrite anything, he said. But I will make sure the world sees the truth. Starting with your eviction notice. She blinked. What? I bought your mortgage this morning. You now rent from Sinclair Holdings. Consider this your final warning. Gasps again. Someone near the bar murmured, Oh my God. My mother stared at me now, not as a daughter, not as her own blood, but like a stranger who had somehow slipped through her iron grip. And I finally found my voice. I begged you for respect, I said. Not your money, not your blessing, just for you to stand by me. I looked around at the white roses, the guests, the shattered glass on the floor. You stood by your ego instead. Then I dropped the mic. Literally. It landed with a loud thud. And, for once, no one tried to pick it up. The clatter of the microphone hitting the marble echoed longer than it should have. Maybe because no one dared move. Not even the breeze stirred. I turned away from my mother. Away from the expressions, some shocked, some embarrassed, some smug, now melting into shame. The white roses that decorated the trellises swayed slightly as I walked back toward the center of the platform, but this time, not as the girl they mocked. This time, I stood tall beside a man who didn't need a last name to be powerful, because his presence alone demanded reverence. Ryan stepped closer, hand hovering just slightly over the small of my back. He wasn't trying to hold me up. He knew I could stand just fine, but he was there. Like he always had been, quiet, consistent, unshaken. Should we continue? He asked me gently. I looked at the wedding officiant, who had frozen behind his podium, still clutching the vows we never got to say. I smiled slightly. We will, but not for them. Ryan tilted his head, curious. Then for who? For us, I said. And for every woman who's ever been pushed off a stage by her own parents, only to rise again. There were murmurs different this time. Not cruel, not mocking, just whispers of awe. People shifting in their seats. A few even stood. And then, wait, a voice called from the back. We all turned. It was my grandmother, 87 years old, wrinkled, regal, leaning on a silver cane. She hadn't said a word the entire time. Not when I was pushed. Not during the reveal. Not during the fallout. She stepped forward now, with more authority in her frail bones than half the crowd combined. I want to say something, she declared. No one stopped her. Not even my mother. She climbed one marble step at a time, shoes clicking softly, until she stood between me and Ryan. She looked at him first. You're Alexander's boy? Ryan nodded. Yes, ma'am. She smiled faintly. He had the sharpest mind I ever saw, and the kindest heart. Then her eyes turned to me, and in front of everyone, she took both my hands in hers. I knew the day you were born, Alyssa, that there was something unbreakable in you. Your mother, my daughter, lost herself in pride and image. I prayed you wouldn't follow. Her voice trembled, but not with fear. I never imagined you'd surpass her in grace this early. But you did. And I'm proud of you. Tears filled my eyes. Thank you, Grandma. But she wasn't done. She turned to the crowd, eyes narrowing at the rows of smug relatives, socialites, and sycophants. You should all be ashamed, she said, voice louder now. I watched you all laugh. I watched you whisper and smirk when this girl was thrown like trash in front of you. She pointed her cane. But let's be honest. How many of you came here today not to celebrate love, but to see her fall? You could have heard a pin drop. She nodded to herself. Well, you got your show. And now you've been outed. She stepped down the stairs slowly, but not before she turned one last time and added, "Oh, and Ryan? I'm updating my will this week. Let's just say your name will be in it now." My mother gasped. What? Mom, are you serious? But Grandma ignored her, just walked back to her chair with her head held higher than any heiress could. Ryan looked at me and chuckled softly. Remind me never to cross your grandma. I smiled through the tears. You'd lose. Just then, the officiant finally cleared his throat. His voice shook as he asked, "Should we proceed with the vows?" Ryan looked at me. I looked at him. And in that instant I realized something. We didn't need a wedding. Not really. We had something far more sacred than a ceremony. A bond that had survived humiliation. That had stared power in the face and didn't blink. Still, I nodded. Yes, I said, voice strong now. Let's finish what we started. The vows were spoken, not with trembling voices or rehearsed lines, but with gritted emotion and the kind of unbreakable certainty only earned through fire. We didn't say, "Till death do us part." We said, "I choose you, even when the world turns its back. I stand with you, even when my own blood pushes me to the ground." And when the officiant finally declared us husband and wife, there was no applause, just stunned silence, because the real ceremony had already happened. But the story wasn't finished. Not even close. As the soft hum of strings resumed and the guests hesitantly moved toward the reception area, awkward, stiff, pretending to be civilized, Ryan leaned over and whispered, "Are you ready for the rest?" I blinked. There's more? His jaw flexed. There's always more when it comes to people like your father. We didn't go to the dance floor. We went straight to the media table. That's where Ryan had left a sealed folder earlier, before the ceremony. He picked it up now, the Sinclair crest glowing faintly in the sunlight. What's in there? I asked. Ryan exhaled. Everything. He didn't explain more. Not until he walked up to the microphone again. Some people were already halfway through champagne. My mother was pretending to laugh with a group of guests like nothing had happened. My father was on his phone, probably calling PR damage control. Ryan tapped the mic twice. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "before we end this, I'd like to share a small gift with the bride's family." My mother froze. My father's face turned pale. This, Ryan held up the folder, is a copy of the original land acquisition agreement from 35 years ago. The one that involves Sinclair Holdings and a failed luxury development company called Arden Real Estate. Whispers began. That name was familiar. Ryan opened the folder. For those who don't know, he continued, Arden Real Estate tried to develop coastal properties on stolen zoning permits. Millions were funneled into fake permits, ghost companies, and illegal bribes. The company collapsed in scandal, but the founder disappeared before charges could be filed. He held up a black and white photo. And here's a younger version of that founder, Peter Langston, also known as Alyssa's father. The crowd erupted. Aunt Marlene gasped so loud, you'd think she'd seen a ghost. Jenna covered her mouth. And my father? His phone dropped from his hand, clattering against the garden tiles. My mother whispered, "No, he said those files were destroyed." Ryan stared at him with contempt. They weren't. He pulled out the next page, a confession. A letter. Signed and time-stamped by someone who used to work under my father back then. In this letter, Ryan said, your former accountant admits that you falsified the permit registry and used a fake shell company to borrow against Sinclair Holdings' projected funds. You stole. You framed your business partner. And then you vanished from that world and rebuilt a new name using your wife's family's influence. My entire body went numb. You've lied to everyone, I whispered. My father looked at me, not with regret, but with fury. You think this matters now? You married into it. You're tainted just like me. No, I said quietly. I married the man whose company you tried to rob blind. I didn't inherit your sins. I buried them today. Ryan snapped the folder shut. I could have sent this to the FBI, he said. But I won't. On one condition. My father scoffed. What condition? Ryan turned to me. You decide. The entire crowd looked at me. For once, all eyes were on me. Not because I was an embarrassment, but because I held power. I walked to my father, slow and steady. Then I leaned in and said, just loud enough for the crowd to hear, I don't need revenge. You've lived your whole life running from shame. But today, you have nowhere left to hide. I turned to the crowd. Let the world know who Peter Langston really is. Let the tabloids run wild. Let the investors back out. Let the deals fall through. And then I looked at Ryan. Send the files. He nodded once. It was done. The message was clear. It wasn't just a wedding anymore. It was a reckoning. As the whispers turned into calls, and phones lit up with headlines faster than the servers could refill champagne, I took off my heels. Yes. Right there in front of everyone. I pulled off the designer shoes my mother had insisted I wear so I would look expensive for once, and I walked across that marble floor barefoot. Because I didn't need to look expensive. I already was priceless. And not because of Ryan. Not because of Sinclair. But because I walked away with my spine intact and my name cleaner than my father's bank records. Ryan wrapped his suit jacket around my shoulders as we stepped away from the chaos. It hung heavy, but it felt like armor. We passed by the rows of tables, half-eaten hors d'oeuvres, glittering chandeliers strung over manicure hedges, and guests who looked too stunned to finish their rows. Someone whispered, that was the most real wedding I've ever seen. Another said, she's going to be on Forbes by next month. But I didn't care anymore. Because at that moment, I was no longer Alyssa Langston, the girl with the messy family. I was Alyssa Sinclair. And the moment that sealed it forever came just as we reached the iron gates of the estate. A sleek black helicopter roared in from above, blades chopping through the sky like judgment itself. It descended right onto the estate's landing pad, on the far end of the property, kicking up gusts of rose petals and shaking the trees as gasps filled the air. My mother clutched her hair. My father backed away from the wind. My relatives ducked and covered like it was the apocalypse. Ryan just smiled. He held my hand tighter and whispered, time to rise above them, literally. We walked toward the aircraft, hand in hand, the dress trailing behind me like a comet. A staff member opened the helicopter door. Ryan helped me in. And as we lifted off the ground, I turned back one last time. Below us? My mother, still frozen. My father, pale and humiliated. The guests, racing to figure out which side to be on now that the tide had turned. And me? I was rising. As the mansion and marble stage became smaller beneath us, Ryan handed me a single envelope. Inside, a photo of a beachfront estate in Maui, with my name on the deed. I bought this months ago, he said, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. I had a feeling you'd need a place where no one ever pushed you off a stage again. I laughed through a tear. You really think of everything? He kissed my forehead. No, just you. The clouds swallowed us soon after. But below, a storm had begun. Not from rain, from truth. And I never looked back. If this story hits you even a little, just hit that like button. It helps more than you think. Don't forget to subscribe if you've ever felt this kind of pain. You're not alone.